I think it's important to admit when you don't know the answer to something. And I don't know the answer to this question. I see both sides and I realize that the only thing down the middle of the road is roadkill. But I get both sides. And so I'm going to try to come to a conclusion today of just how sacred the Army-Navy game should be to the college football calendar. I don't know. Genuinely don't know. I think with the changes to the college football playoff, the way everything is structured and scheduled now, I understand the idea that Army-Navy should have a day to itself. I understand the importance not just on the football field, but off the field and what the game means, not only to the players, but the branches of the military, to the country, etc. I get it. I wholeheartedly understand it. And I'm in agreement that it should deserve its own day on the college football calendar, because how many days outside of Army versus Navy do those teams get the attention that they deserve? It's generally not that often, unless you've got a really good player from one of those programs. In the last 20 years or so, it's almost been kind of exclusively Navy that's been the really good player situation, whether it was Kyle Eckel back in the day or Keenan Reynolds, Malcolm Perry. Those players, those programs don't get the attention that they deserve generally. I'm of the belief that, like, I think Army, Navy, Air Force should get automatic bowl berths every year. Like, hey, even if they're 2-10, like, hey, guess what? Army gets to go to a bowl game. Air Force gets to go to a bowl game. Navy gets to go to a bowl. Now, I realize you can't do that because they're not operating in the same sense that everybody else in America is operating. And I think if they get a trip to, and the likelihood that they're going to get a trip to one of the more desirable bowl games, if they're not bowl eligible, isn't really high. So I don't know if Air Force going to, like, the famous Idaho Potato Bowl is going to be a big trip for them. I don't know. But I'm of that belief. It's never going to happen, and I don't know that it should. But I think, they should be rewarded with that. But tangent. The idea that Army and Navy, or even Army versus Air Force, Navy versus Air Force, whatever the case may be, doesn't get the attention, notoriety, love that it deserves, I think is fair and warranted. And I think that they should have their own day where the college football world is focused on Army versus Navy. And that's not going to be the case in 2024. With the bowl schedule coming out last week, we got a glimpse of, there's going to be 2 bowl games that day. The Celebration Bowl, which is for HBCU, is going to start at noon, which I don't know is a huge factor against Army-Navy. It's a noon game on ABC against some kind of, like, frankly, smaller brands on the national stage. And whether you could probably argue that the Celebration Bowl should be its own day on the college football schedule, but that might be another topic for another day. That's going to start at noon. Army-Navy's later in the day. The Heisman Trophy ceremony is that night. And then at 9 o'clock on ESPN, the Camellia Bowl in Montgomery, Alabama, will take place. So it's really a pretty chocked full day of college football. You get a game at noon, which is basically the HBCU National Championship, Army versus Navy, the Heisman Trophy ceremony, and then a bowl game after the Heisman Trophy ceremony, which, by the way, I think is probably a pretty good idea. Of, like, you've got a captive college football audience on ESPN, and then what do they want to watch? College football. It's a pretty good idea. But in the past, that Saturday had been strictly for Army-Navy, and then if the Heisman Trophy ceremony worked at the Heisman Trophy ceremony. So should Army-Navy have its own day? I think the answer to that is yeah. But I'm also realistic in looking at the schedule going, okay, where do you put the Celebration Bowl? Where do you put the Camellia Bowl? In this day and age, nobody's going to let damn near anything have the spotlight by itself. You've seen it in the past couple of years, right? Where for a really long time, the NBA owned Christmas Day. Well, now Christmas Day is on a Wednesday this year, and the NFL is putting games on Christmas Day. For a long time, college football was the only thing on New Year's Day, and now the NHL plays their Winter Classic, their biggest event, up against college football bowl games on New Year's Day. Nobody lets anybody have anything to themselves anymore, except for the NFL. The NFL gets Sundays, right? Well, NASCAR still races on Sundays. Major League Baseball still plays on Sundays. The NHL plays games on Sundays. The only reason that college football has Saturdays in the fall and Fridays in the fall, and high school football has Fridays in the fall, is because there are laws against the NFL playing games on Fridays and Saturdays until mid-December. Because otherwise, I'm here to tell you that there would be Friday night football from the NFL, or there'd be Saturday football. Every game would be on national TV if that were the case. They would figure out a way to play on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday every week. But they can't, so they don't. But we just live in this day and age where nobody's allowed to have anything to themselves, that there has to be competition on TV for everything. And while it might be the one college football game a year that you could argue, like, this deserves its own day, this deserves to be the focus, I just don't know that we live in a world anymore where that is realistic. And whether or not that is fair or right or disgusting is probably a bigger discussion that I'm not equipped to have by myself on this platform. I don't know the answer. I think it's important to march towards the correct information or the right opinion or whatever the case may be. Like, if you're asking the question, I think you should be asking the question because you want the answer. You don't know, rather than like having an agenda or whatever the case may be. I don't have an agenda. I don't know the answer. I would lean towards, start every other bowl game on Tuesday after Army Navy. At the same time, I don't know that the Camellia Bowl is going to be a big enough draw to be like the idea that if you are of the belief that Army Navy should be the only game that day, I understand. But the idea of like the Camellia Bowl is going to pit Appalachian State versus Toledo against one another is going to draw like a large faction of eyeballs and attention and notoriety away from Army Navy. I just don't think is true. I don't think that an idea that Jackson State playing Morgan State in the Celebration Bowl is going to be, it's just not going to take away from Army Navy. I don't think. In recent years, I don't think the Heisman Trophy ceremony has taken away from Army Navy, that there hasn't really been a like, man, I don't know who's going to win. We haven't really had a super tight race all that frequently, all that often. And so I think while there might be other things going on, it's sort of like, I don't even know what the best analogy would be. You're still the top dog on that day. Everybody that wakes up on the Army Navy Saturday that's a college football fan, or even maybe a sports fan, knows that that is kind of the marquee event that day. Now, if there are other factors, if the NFL wants to put a big time game on that Saturday, yeah, that sucks. Or if the NBA wants to do some marquee event, that does suck, and you can have an argument that this is ridiculous. But I think college football can only worry about college football, right? Like, you're only going to have so much influence over ESPN for the Camellia Bowl or the Heisman Trophy ceremony or the Celebration Bowl, rather than like if Army Navy believes that Army Navy should be the only sporting event that day. Well, sorry, but you're not going to talk the NBA or NHL out of that. It's just, you just don't have that power. Now, whether you should or not is again a different discussion for a different day. There are all sorts of culture war discussions you can have in regards to Army Navy. It's still super important. It's still filled with pageantry. It still gets the national TV window that it deserves, and it's still the sole college football game going on at that time. And I think all of those things going for it means that it still has a ton of importance on that day. It just doesn't have the exclusivity of that day that it might have once had. I think it's a really interesting and fascinating discussion because I see both sides of the coin, and I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer. I don't know that you can go wrong in either way. If everybody was to say, hey, you know what? Like these guys, these players, these programs, these future service members deserve the entire country watching this game and only this game. I get it. At the same time, I don't blame damn near every other TV network that thinks I've got to do something to get people to not watch CBS from 3:30 to 7:30 that day. It's just the world we live in now. Whether that's fair, unfair, I don't know. But nobody gets anything really to themselves anymore. And I don't know if we're better for it or not. But I think the importance of the game still matters. I think the importance of the game is still there despite there being other things going on that day. I don't think what the game means is diminished if it doesn't have exclusivity that day. I think that's where I land on it. Want to know what you think? Hit us up in the comments down below. Let's have that conversation. That'll do it for today's edition of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content that we're pumping out. If you're listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. I'll see you tomorrow for another episode of the Daily Huddle.